Welcome to Here I Pod from ELCA Advocacy. A new social statement, Faith and Civic Life, seeking the well-being of all, was adopted by the ELCA Churchwide Assembly in 2025. Here I Pod presents a reading of the social statement separated into 6 sections. Our recording of Faith and Civic Life began shortly after adoption, before a final copy was publicly available. So listeners are encouraged to refer to the ELCA Resource Center for the final, fully annotated version, linked in the show notes and reflected in the captions. While many contextual endnotes are read, not all are, but they can be found in the final, fully annotated version. Now we continue with Section 5, Constructive Relationships between Religious Organizations and Political Authority. Let's begin.
Section 5. Constructive Relationships between Religious Organizations and Political Authority. Article 34. As God's people pray for God's will to be done on earth, it is necessary to set forth ELCA teaching about the constructive relationship of religious organizations to political authority. The U.S. Constitution, including the First Amendment, neither prohibits religious institutions from actively engaging in civic and political life, nor requires them to do so. The Constitution leaves those decisions largely to religious institutions themselves. The basis for the ELCA's understanding of this church's relationship with government is twofold. First, this church teaches a scriptural responsibility before God to join divine activity toward the well-being of society. It is God who gives the church a responsibility to address society's issues under the aspect of God's law, while also conveying the good news of mercy and life to individuals. Yet, in this approach, there is always a creative tension because God's church is, quote, in, close quote, the world, while not, quote, from, close quote, the world. Note, the church and society, 3. As a church, the ecclesiastical estate interacts with the state, the political estate. It is not the gospel, narrow sense, but the law that it is called to speak. This is the civil and first use of the law. End note. Second, as a corporate body in society, the church corporately takes to heart God's gift of an earthly sovereignty that resides in, quote, we the people, close quote. The theological conviction of responsibility before God and the reasoned conviction about the consent of the government intersect to undergird a productive relationship. The ELCA Constitution expresses this understanding as a calling to, quote, work with civil authorities in areas of mutual endeavor, maintaining institutional separation of church and state in a relation of functional interaction, close quote.
Article 35. The phrase, quote, work with civil authorities in areas of mutual endeavor, close quote, makes clear that the church should engage political authority actively and flexibly. Theologically speaking, quote, work with, close quote, depends upon a dynamic Lutheran understanding of God's 2 reigns, especially the left-handed reign by which God's work in society is carried out primarily through a just use of the law. This church holds that the triune God, our all-encompassing source and commitment, is at work in society and calls the church and all religious organizations to join in public action, relying upon their best understanding of God's intention for creation and society. This church also understands, quote, work with, close quote, as grounded in the foundational commitment that sovereignty in the United States rests in, quote, we the people, close quote. Both individuals and corporate bodies in the U.S. find their purpose summed up in the preamble to the Constitution, quote, to promote the general welfare, close quote. These constitutional underpinnings encourage those who live in this country and all organizations and institutions to work with governing authorities toward that end. Living in the U.S. implies a promise and opportunity to seek the welfare of all residents through every aspect of civic life. This does not imply that this church's relationship with the political authority is cozy. Often, to be sure, quote, working with, close quote, affirms the mutual endeavor of addressing human needs. Sometimes, however, quote, working with, close quote, entails critical challenges to government, such as advocating for change in policies and programs that harm people and creation.
Article 36. The phrase, quote, maintaining institutional separation of church and state, close quote, does not point to a, quote, wall of separation, close quote, between public government and private religious arenas. Rather, the integrity of the institutional relationship depends on understanding proper and distinct jurisdictions. On the one hand, theologically, such a distinction is congruent with the Lutheran understanding of how God works differently in the church and in the state. Beyond common human faculties, religious faith does not provide revelatory or other special knowledge regarding the practical policies or means for government's work. On the other hand, quote, institutional separation, close quote, also follows the logic of the U.S. Constitution. It points to preserving the integrity and distinction of both political authority and religious institutions based on their distinctive purposes, organizational principles, and competencies. While institutionally distinct, religious organizations and institutions share spaces of mutual concern and action with government. The ELCA therefore holds that this relationship should be one of, quote, functional interaction, close quote. That is, it is a critical engagement governed by institutional boundaries created on the one side by the faith-based purpose and competence of religious faith and institutions, and on the other side by the secular purpose and competence of government. Religious organizations then cross the boundaries of their role when they campaign for parties or candidates or specific legislation or policies as, quote, God's plan, close quote. Religious communities are mistaken when they identify a particular political movement as God's or claim divine revelation for the Constitution or identify the U.S. national experience with salvation history. For these reasons, this church, unlike some Christian churches, teaches that it is not the church's role to endorse candidates or parties. The ELCA also recognizes the legal soundness of the Johnson Amendment in prohibiting religious bodies or their representatives from verbally or financially supporting candidates or parties. Note, the Johnson Amendment is a provision in the U.S. tax code since 1954 that prohibits all 501c3 nonprofit organizations from endorsing or opposing political candidates. End note. Individual parishioners may, of course, advocate specific candidates and parties based on religious values and reasoning criteria, but should not claim to do so as spokespeople for a church. At the same time, this dynamic, critical engagement approach encourages religious organizations to champion values in the public sphere for the sake of society's good. The ELCA teaches that religious communities may speak publicly about their values to express support for policies and legislation that seem the best among competing legislation or policy. This church, for example, actively assesses and advocates for policies that affect those who are hungry. Matthew chapter 25, verse 35.
Article 37. In the work of functional interaction, churches and other nonprofits in the U.S. have become increasingly dependent on aid from public entities. The ELCA continues to support the prime criterion that government support for faith-based social service organizations is appropriate only when they, as religious-based organizations, serve people without expectation about or regard to their faith. ELCA ministries, such as chaplaincy in the armed services, correctional institutions, hospitals, and other care facilities, meet this criterion, as do ELCA social ministry organizations. The ELCA view asserts a complicated protection that enables support of good government while insisting on the important distinction between religion and civil authority. To maintain the distinction, the ELCA holds that government must not fund programs that discriminate between religions in providing their services and benefits. Government must not fund programs that require recipients to participate in religious activities as a condition of receiving a public service. Government must treat program service providers equally on religious and other grounds, and selection of funded service providers must be based solely on outcomes identified in publicly available criteria. This dynamic, function-driven interactionist relationship has guided constructive, beneficial interactions between the ELCA and political authority. Note, the designation, quote, functional-driven interactionist approach, close quote, is found in Roger A. Willer's Religious Organizations and Government, an Ecclesial Lutheran Take. End note. Our church will continue to be so guided. As a church, we also commend this approach as salutary, both theologically and practically, for consideration by other religious bodies in their interaction with political authority in the U.S.
Article 38. The ELCA understanding of civic life and faith affirms healthy forms of patriotism. Patriotism is to love one's country, to pray for its well-being, to be committed to its success, to have a sense of pride in it, to criticize it, and to work for its reform when necessary. All of these can be elements of how Christians and their communities live out discipleship as individuals and corporate bodies. There are also unhealthy expressions of patriotism. They actually are distortions of true patriotism and can be dangerous for the country and for vulnerable populations within it. Such forms of unhealthy patriotism attribute to the country, to a political party, to certain individuals, or even to a racial or ethnic group, a veneration, worship, loyalty, or trust owed to God alone. Mark chapter 12, verse 17. Christ, church, cannot condone elevating a country or anything else to the place that belongs only to God, because this is succumbing to idolatry. This statement rejects unhealthy forms of patriotism, including those related to any form of religious nationalism. Note, a variety of religious nationalisms exists in the U.S. and globally. Many are addressed in, quote, The Problem of Religious Nationalism in the U.S. and Globally, a policy statement of the National Council of Churches. The presence in the United States of Christian Zionism is one example. See, quote, Hope for a Future, a study document for renewing Jewish-Christian relations, close quote, and the, quote, Christian Zionism, close quote, issue of the Journal of Lutheran Ethics, May 2007, as helpful starting points. End note. At the time of this writing, there is a peculiar form of unhealthy patriotism gaining traction in the United States, Christian nationalism. Christian nationalist belief seeks to fuse selected Christian ideas about what should be the national way of life with a comprehensive cultural framework. That framework incorporates highly selective narratives, practices, symbols, and value systems. For example, quote, in a Christian nation, social power is placed in the service of the Christian religion, close quote. Christian nationalism explicitly seeks to implement such a legislative framework, yet this, quote, turns God into a mascot for the state, close quote. In hardline strands of Christian nationalism, only white, U.S.-born Christian believers are considered genuine U.S. citizens. This privileging of white, U.S.-born Christians is connected to our country's violent practice of white superiority, such as Jim Crow laws or the hundreds of years of Black African slavery. Such belief in an intrinsic moral and intellectual superiority of white European Christian civilization has been used to justify as natural and right that white Christians, especially males, should be in power. Such views about race, ethnicity, sex, social, economic class, and religion deny that one's birth in the nation or one's great contributions and service to the country are enough for a resident to be considered a, quote, true American, close quote. It distorts who is considered to be a true citizen of the nation. A comparison of any strand of religious nationalism, including Christian nationalism, with the actual teachings of Jesus and of the Holy Scriptures reveals that these values are not Christ-like. Christian nationalism, in particular, perverts the Christian message by cherry-picking texts that interpret the Scriptures in ways that connect religion to domination. Christian nationalism fuses an imagined conception of a Christian nation with a false vision of God's ultimate will. It confuses the kingdom of God with a particular government. Jesus rejects identification of earthly structures with God's kingdom or will. Quote, "My kingdom does not belong to this world," close quote, John chapter 18, verse 36. Lutherans teach that the kingdom of God is not a nation, not a particular culture, not a racial grouping, not a form of government, and not even a denomination or religion. For theological reasons, the ELCA repudiates Christian nationalism as a distortion of the Christian faith that crosses the line into idolatry. This church also realizes that Christian nationalism contradicts the U.S. motto, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. It effectively substitutes, quote, "we the self-declared true American Christians," close quote, for, quote, "we the people," close quote. It is an unhealthy form of patriotism that harms this country, divides it, and especially endangers the well-being of vulnerable members of our society.
This concludes the reading of Section 5, Constructive Relationships Between Religious Organizations and Political Authority. Audio presentations of all 6 sections of the ELCA Social Statement, Faith and Civic Life, Seeking the Well-Being of All, are available from Pure iPod from ELCA Advocacy. Find a link to the final, fully annotated version of the social statement in our show notes and from elca.org. Thank you for listening.